Welcome to America Now. I'm Don Brown. On America Now, we are staunchly pro-American. We're proud of our military. We love our country. We proudly stand for the anthem, and we humbly kneel for the cross. On America Now, our viewpoint is America first and America always. And we look at issues through the vision of a biblical worldview. And speaking of visions, we adopt Ronald Reagan's vision of America as a shining city on a hill. Now, today's topic, the takeover on the horizon, the left's strategy to destroy the United States Constitution. In the final weeks of the Kavanaugh confirmation, we saw the left come totally unhinged on TV in a public way, in a way that maybe the public hasn't ever seen before. You know, sort of like zombies from that movie Invasion of the Body Snatchers. These leftists literally surrounded and stormed the doors of the Supreme Court. And with the look of someone possessed, and maybe some of them were, they literally scratched and clawed and banged on the front door as Brett Kavanaugh was literally being sworn into the court. This court storming was led by Democrat activist Linda Sarsour, the Muslim woman masquerading as a woman's advocate, which is kind of a joke because Islam treats women like dogs. The Quran, of course, sanctions wife-beating. And because Sarsour has headed those so-called women's marches, which feature this screaming, yelling, fist-shaking, and extreme vulgarity. And even, as you remember, Madonna threatened to blow up the White House in the first women's march after Trump was nominated. Before the confirmation, these leftists entered the U.S. Senate chamber. They occupied gallery seats in the balcony. They screamed to the top of their lungs. They forced Vice President Pence to order the sergeant at arms to restore order. The conduct inside the Senate hearing room was despicable as they disrupted, interrupted, and repeatedly got themselves arrested by design. But while the Kavanaugh hearing may have shed intense public light on leftist Democrat activities, unfortunately, outrageous conduct and tactics are nothing new, at least not with the last 5 to 6 years. These far-left groups converged on and forced Senator Ted Cruz and his wife and DHS Secretary Kristen Nielsen and their families from public restaurants. As you may know, they forced Sarah Huckabee Sanders and her family out of a restaurant in Northern Virginia. And they treated her like she was some kind of a dog. These mobs have gotten into the faces of Senator Mitch McConnell and his wife, Elaine Chao, and they've gone after Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi, who was with her boyfriend, and all they were trying to do was mind their own business and simply watch the movie Mr. Rogers at a theater in Florida. But yet these leftists go after a couple just trying to watch Mr. Rogers, and they yell, "Shame on you," they yelled at Pam as they proceeded to actually spit in her face. Well, it's the same old tactic. They scream slogans like shame, 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 or, hey, hey, ho, ho, Donald Trump, or insert whoever you want to, has got to go. Not exactly Shakespearean literary genius, whoever writes their lines. But unfortunately, it's not just the crass and cacophonous noise that the left is making. They are also increasingly turning to physical violence. Now let's take a look at just some of the recent examples of mob violence and mob rule from the political left. June 2017, a Democratic terrorist and Bernie Sanders supporter who raged against Donald Trump on Facebook tried to murder some 20 Republican lawmakers, members of the U.S. Congress, at a charity baseball practice in Alexandria, Virginia. The Attorney General of Virginia concluded that this attack was fueled by rage against Republican legislatures and called it an act of terrorism. The Democratic shooter shot and almost killed Representative Steve Scalise, who nearly lost his life and whose recovery took nearly a year. Still, the left-wing media refused to acknowledge the truth that this was a calculated left-wing political attack, attempted murder on a large number of Republican members of Congress. The left downplayed it as a deranged lone gunman, and they certainly didn't want to discuss the killer's political affiliation. But the affiliation was clear. I'll bet they didn't want to discuss it. Think of what would have happened if the shooter had been a Republican and gone after Democrat members of Congress. Can you imagine the hue and the cry? We'd still be talking about it today. Just 5 months after that attack, though, they still weren't finished. November of 2017, Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky was attacked by one of his neighbors who also happened to be a left-wing lunatic. 6 of Senator Paul's ribs were broken. And just as it took several months for Representative Scalise to recover, it would also take several months for Senator Paul to recover. The liberal media tried to make this appear that this was a property dispute between neighbors. Not true. The man who attacked Senator Paul was aggressively anti-Trump and anti-GOP on his social media. He, on his social media, called for the impeachment of the president and urged Russia special counsel investigator Robert Mueller to fry Trump's, well, we won't say what he wanted to fry on Christian television. But this Democrat attacker wanted to actually beat a political opponent with who he disagreed with. And despite this near assassination of large portions of the blocks of the Congress who were Republican all at once, and the near-death experience of Steve Scalise, and the serious permanent injury to Rand Paul, Democrat politicians still have not tried to turn down their heated rhetoric at all. In fact, their incendiary rhetoric has just gotten worse. Now let's take a moment to listen to this short video from the Republican National Committee documenting some of their statements.
When they go low, we kick them.
And if you see anybody in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd. And you push back on them. And you tell them they're not welcome.
I just don't even know why there aren't uprisings all over the country. Maybe there will be. You cannot be civil with a political party that wants to destroy what you stand for, what you care about.
Get up and please get up in the face of some Congress people.
Is this the quote unquote mob?
So what exactly is going on here? Well, here's what's going on. There is a takeover on the horizon. There is an organized attempt by the political left to destroy the United States Constitution and to replace it with a socialist dictatorship. Now, how is the left going to seek to bring down the Constitution and to end the American Republic? This takeover is being implemented by a strategy of controlled demolition. Now, have you ever seen a skyscraper brought down with explosives? Dynamite and TNT is placed in various places within the building, and then it's set off in close sequence and coordination. Now, can we recognize what they're doing? Can we recognize and then push back their efforts to destroy the Constitution? Well, yes, we can. But we first must clearly recognize the strategy of the enemy. That's what we're going to discuss here within the next few minutes and in the next couple of shows. Now, this controlled demolition against the Constitution is based upon three destructive and explosive components that they are now using against your freedoms. These are as follows. I'll outline them and then we'll jump into them. The first destructive component is judicial tyranny. That is runaway judges who simply make up whatever law they want to make up according to what the left wants. The second destructive component, left-wing political organizations that are highly funded and highly organized, and we'll get into those in the next show. And the third destructive component, perhaps the scariest of all these days, left-wing violent groups that are actively inflicting violence on conservatives and Christians, as we saw in the attempted murder of members of the Congress. So their strategy is threefold: to corrupt judges to make their own version of the law to gain power, 2, to use propaganda, and 3, to use physical force. Today we focus on judicial tyranny, on that component of their destructive strategy. Now first, and we've spoken about this before, but judicial tyranny, we must understand that this is the first building block in their path to dictatorship. We begin to understand now why they throw on the switch and made such fools of themselves when Brett Kavanaugh and other conservative judges are now being nominated to the court. Because to make their plan work, to destroy the republic, they first need a majority of judges, not a minority of judges. But they need a majority, and especially on the Supreme Court. And Kavanaugh threatened that balance. The man that he replaced, Anthony Kennedy, authored the opinion legalizing gay marriage, for example. Kennedy was a swing vote. From what I've studied of Kavanaugh, I don't think he's going to be a swing vote, and they know it. The left has depended for almost 50 years on left-wing runaway judges who would throw the Constitution into the trash can and simply make up, well, whatever law they want to make up, regardless of what people think and regardless of what the Congress thinks. Think about that for a second. The Constitution has a number of checks and balances to curb federal power. One of the greatest checks and balances is separation of powers. That means each branch, Congress, the president, and the courts have their own limited, with the emphasis being on limited, roles, and each branch is not to cross over into the role of the other branch. Under the Constitution, the judiciary is supposed to be the weakest of the three branches. Many of the founders, including Jefferson and Hamilton especially, warned against the dangers of judicial tyranny, where judges step beyond their limited roles under the Constitution and become not just judges, but they also become legislators and, in effect, yes, dictators. Unfortunately, that has happened, and it's been happening more and more as leftists have been appointed to the courts. Think about this. Since 1973, over 60 million Americans have been slaughtered by the abortionist knives and suction cups. And here's the thing. The Congress did not pass a law for abortion. The state legislatures did not pass it or authorize it. The United States Supreme Court, in a case called Roe v. Wade, simply declared one day that abortion was constitutional, and there you have it. Made it up, out of the blue. Likewise, it was judges acting as tyrants without authority, and not the Congress and not the people, but judges who took prayer out of the public schools and said school administrators could no longer lead prayer and lead their kids in prayer in the schools. Well, now, how has that gone over so far? Prayer out of the schools, God out of the classroom to make room for drugs, for premarital sex, for an increasing slide of academic failure measured against other countries, especially Pacific Rim countries, to a culture where kids now have their noses and eyeballs glued to cell phones instead of books. And here's another example of judicial tyranny. Recently, despite the fact that the majority of states in the United States, in fact, 31 states to be precise, over 60% of the states passed laws or constitutional amendments to their constitutions to declare the biblical concept of marriage as between one man and one woman, which is the biblical definition. But a string of left-wing federal judges just popped up and struck down those amendments. And the United States Supreme Court suddenly declared homosexual marriage as legal in the United States. Now, to be clear, this law legalizing homosexual marriage was never passed by the people or by the legislature. In fact, as I said, 60% of these states had rejected it specifically. But it was simply invented by the federal courts, invented. Judges turning into legislatures, judges turning into dictators. This is something the courts simply don't have the power. They do not have this power under the Constitution. They just take it. Now, as we discussed also in earlier shows, immediately after the election of Donald Trump, the president signed a perfectly legal executive order to ban and restrict certain immigration temporarily from certain Muslim countries. Well, the left went berserk. Resist, fight, shake your fist. So they went judge shopping for left-wing judges and filed lawsuits in front of liberal left-wing federal judges James Robart of Seattle and Derek Watson of Honolulu. Watson, by the way, was Obama's classmate at Harvard Law School. Now, stepping beyond their judicial powers and stepping beyond the role given to the courts by the Constitution, these judges issued illegal and unconstitutional orders against the Trump administration. They were illegal and unconstitutional from the moment they were signed. Those of us who knew the law knew the orders were illegal. We knew they were unconstitutional, and eventually the Supreme Court struck down these runaway judges. But it took almost a solid year while that travel ban was watered down and put out of effect. Now, I want you to think about this. In the United States, there are currently 870 federal judges under Article 3. Article 3 starts with the Supreme Court, and then there are other courts included. So when we say 870, we're including all the judges from the Supreme Court down. Of course, of those 879 are on the U.S. Supreme Court. 179 are on courts of appeals, including the radical Ninth Circuit out in California. But get this, 673 of those district court judges are the judges like Judge Robarts, who under our insane structure, any one of 673 individual judges appointed and created by the Congress, by the way, can snap their finger and bring the President of the United States to his knees by the stroke of a pen. That's how insane the situation with judicial tyranny has gotten here in 2018. Now, that is not the way the Constitution set it up, but that is the left's game plan number one, which is why they turned into zombies from the invasion of the body snatchers when Brett Kavanaugh was about to be confirmed to the Supreme Court, and why they made up last-second scurrilous and slanderous allegations against him. Why do they get away with it, though? They get away with it only because we let them get away with it. This goes back to a case, 1803, called Marbury versus Madison, when the court claimed the right for itself for something called judicial review. Judicial review, meaning it claimed the right itself to oversee and veto anything done by the president and the Congress. But that right was not granted to the courts in the Constitution. The court just grabbed it. And Congress and the president at the time, who was Thomas Jefferson, actually, they were too lazy to push back at the time. But now, 215 years after Marbury versus Madison, we find ourselves in the middle of a widening judicial crisis. Let me take a moment to pose this question to President Trump. And Mr. Trump, I'm going to give you, Mr. President, a little free constitutional advice. If you're listening, sir, consider this scenario. Let's say there is a blow-up in the Middle East. Radical Islamists have seized control of one of our embassies and are holding Americans hostage, just like happened in 1979 and just like it's happened at other times. Since 1941, the first question every president always asks in an international crisis are, where are the aircraft carriers? And you, sir, as Commander-in-Chief, have 3 naval task force stationed at North Island Naval Air Station in San Diego. Let's decide you want to dispatch USS Carl Vinson from San Diego to the Middle East to protect our embassy, which is under siege. You want the Vinson to set sail within 48 hours. But wait, some Democrat in the resistance, one of your many opponents who will resist, if nothing else, decides it would cause environmental harm to San Diego Bay for the ship to set sail, and that moreover, you don't have the authority to order the ship to set sail, and that the mission would be anti-Muslim, since Muslim radicals have grabbed our embassy and would violate separation of church and state. Now, of course, these are crazy arguments, Mr. President, but they are no more crazy than the argument that was made by the left when they tried to block your temporary travel ban after you were inaugurated in 2017. So some left-wing group, maybe the ACLU, maybe the Muslim Brotherhood, file suit, and they bring the suit in front of a left-wing federal judge appointed by your predecessor, Obama. And that nutcase judge, sort of like the nutcase judge in Seattle and Hawaii, issues an order preventing you from allowing the Carl Vinson to steam out of port in San Diego to go help our hostages. Your military advisors have told you should send the Vinson and its battle group, that it will help to ease tensions there. So what are you going to do, Mr. President? Our people are captured, but the left-wing judges have said you can't let the ship sail. Well, let me give you a little free advice. In that situation, you should simply disobey the federal judge, and you should set the ship on its course to the west part of the Pacific anyway. Meanwhile, we have American hostages captured, and there really is no other choice. If a federal judge issues that order, you should tell the judge to go pound sand and that the order is void as being in violation of separation of powers, and you should order the ship to sail. Federal judges have no authority whatsoever to intervene or to interfere with your role as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. Just like the federal courts likewise have no authority to interfere in your executive function in carrying out immigration policy and immigration law as set down by the United States Congress. Our first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, understood fully the unconstitutional nature of judicial tyranny, and Lincoln ignored overreaching judges. In 1861, the U.S. was in a civil war. The military situation around Washington was considered an emergency. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution says the writ of habeas corpus should not be suspended unless in 2 cases. One, in cases of rebellion, which is what was going on, or invasion by the enemy. Habeas corpus comes from the English common law, and it basically is the power of a court to require a person who is incarcerated to be brought before that court. Lincoln had determined that under Article 1, Section 9, the country was in a period of rebellion, and he suspended habeas corpus. Meanwhile, a citizen of Maryland named John Merriman had been arrested and was being held at Fort McHenry in Baltimore. Merriman was a lieutenant in the Maryland militia and was burning bridges, preventing federal troops from coming into Baltimore. Now, the Chief Justice, get this, not some district court judge, but the Chief Justice of the United States at the time, Roger Taney, issued an opinion that President Lincoln did not have the authority to suspend habeas corpus and demanded that the prisoner, Mr. Merriman, be brought before the Supreme Court. Well, you know what President Lincoln did after that unconstitutional order was issued by the Chief Justice? Here's what he did. He ignored it. He did not comply with the order, and he did not order his administration to comply with an unconstitutional order. And that was an order not from a district judge like Robarts in Seattle or Watson in Hawaii, but from the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. President Lincoln understood separation of powers, and he also understood that the judiciary has no real power over the executive, and especially in the midst of a rebellion on the verge of a civil war, which is where we may be headed again, by the way, if things don't change. Lincoln ignored the unconstitutional order. Now today, we must be active in encouraging our senators to select only original constructionists to courts and to the Supreme Court. Originalists interpret the Constitution as is and don't make things up. Justice Kavanaugh claims to be an originalist, and his record tends to show that he is. Revisionist judges, however, as opposed to originalist judges, revisionist judges like Judge Watson and Judge Robarts, however, they have become enemies of the Republic because they simply make things up as they go, however the left wants them to make them up. And we should write President Trump and encourage him to stand down to any runaway district court judges like Robarts who issue blatantly unconstitutional orders. Next time, we'll be looking at left-wing political groups who constitute the second destructive block of the left's attempt to take over and destroy the Constitution. Until then, we'll be right back after this break. Very often I get asked about my very first novel that was released, Treason. Treason was the first of 13 books that I've had published. This was released in 2005 through Zondervan Publishing Company. Treason is a novel. It's a military novel about a Navy JAG officer named Zach Brewer, and it's designed basically to warn against the dangers of radical Islamic infiltration into the military. Now, why did I write the book? Well, I was a JAG officer, and my last duty station was at the Pentagon. And just a few years after I left the Pentagon, my office was destroyed on 9/11, and it got me thinking. So I began to research this issue of radical Islam, and I wrote this book, What If? So the book is about a young JAG officer who winds up prosecuting 3 Islamic imams, chaplains, Navy chaplains, for treason. His name is Zach Brewer, and he faces the world's greatest defense attorney, Wells Levinson, in the book. The book's got great reviews. Of course, some people don't like it. If you're pro-Islamic, you might not like it, but I'm hoping the book will do a couple of things. One, I want to entertain, which you need to do in a novel, but 2, I also want to expose and teach the real dangers of radical Islam. Just before Thanksgiving of 2009, I got an email alert through Google that Treason had risen to number 1 in the world on Amazon. The week of Thanksgiving 2009 was the number 1 fiction seller on Amazon in the world. Why is that? Well, I called my agent, and he said, I can't explain this, but the book, some people say, predicted Fort Hood. It has a storyline very similar to what happened to Fort Hood. The book was released 4 years before Fort Hood. So I hope you'll read it. I hope you'll pass it on. I hope you'll enjoy it. It does expose this danger of radical Islam that threatens our constitutional republic. If you want Treason, you can order it here at the MorningStar bookstore by calling 888-778-7141. Let me repeat, 888-778-7141. You can go to the MorningStar website also, which is store.morningstarministries.org. One more time, store.morningstarministries.org. Please order Treason. Please read it. Please pass it along. And I look forward to your feedback. Thank you so much. Welcome back. Our thought from the day, perhaps appropriately so, comes from the great patriot, Patrick Henry, who said, if we fail to check the power of the judiciary, I predict that we will eventually live under judicial tyranny. How much wisdom the great patriot had. Which brings us to even better news, our good news for today, which comes from Paul's letter, his first letter, that is, to Timothy. There is one mediator, there is one God and one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus, who gave himself as a ransom for all. Well, that's our show for the week, and we hope you've enjoyed it. We look forward to seeing you back here next week when we take this topic up a bit more. Remember this, until then, America first, America always, and God bless America. Thank you.